I'm talking now about somehow how to evaluate and measure stress. I know I'm now a little bit off the topic, but hopefully I connect to Helmut's great presentation in the morning, and probably I can raise some ideas how we can use another tool to improve or let's say optimize rehabilitation strategies. So what comes out of this is one question: how can we evaluate, let's say, in a first run stress? Uh, Even so, everyone knows what stress is, and I'm sure everyone already experienced stress. It comes more and more in the focus of research because we know, and as I pointed out here, that some market group of insurance alliances pointed out that 39% of Austrian workforce perceive the work-related stress as severe. So, and as we know from other publications, that we assume that stress very much inflicts our health and our quality of life. Interestingly, there are no clear clinical definitions up to now what stress is. In a couple of years ago, we found stress described as negative emotional experiences, but more recent stress is now defined as an organism's total response to environmental demands or pressure. Why it is so hard to define stress? Because a single person can react differently with stress symptoms, even if the same situation is repeated. And also there's no clear response to a situation. Also, people amongst others react different to the same kind of stress. Talking about stress, there are two pathways involved. On the one hand, I switch on the laser pointer. On the one hand, the sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic nervous system are cooperating when it comes to stress. Actually defining acute stress, that's a typical normal reaction of the body to an unpredicted or difficult, challenging situation, absolutely necessary that we survive throughout hundreds of years. And in the graph on the right side, you see how sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system is cooperating when it comes to a stressful situation. When you start from an ideal point of view, we have some activity in the parasympathetic nervous system, so we are relaxed, and nearly no activity on the sympathetic nervous system. Now it comes to a stressor, and we see that parasympathetic nervous system goes down and sympathetic nervous system goes up. Ideally, after all, we should return to the initial situation. But when we are in an overstressed or more or less chronic stress situation, we fail to recover completely back to the initial state after a stressful situation. Actually, it turns out that chronic stress, as I mentioned, is a serial health issue. We assume these days that depression, cardiovascular disease, insulin insensitivity, cancer, inflammatory responses are strongly related to chronic stress, which means, as I pointed out, a disbalance between autonomic nervous system and more activity in the sympathetic than parasympathetic parts. How can we now evaluate the stress level of persons, of our patients? Different methods are state-of-the-art, like self-assessment, performance measurement. Classically, proofreading tasks are used to evaluate the stress level of a person. Of course, chemical biomarkers are used. Therefore, it is necessary to get blood samples or salvia. Physiological biomarkers are also investigated, like blood pressure, heart rate. But all of these are relatively time-consuming, probably invasive, and also require some baseline measurements, and that might be really complex. What I want to introduce as a relatively simple method of evaluating the arousal level of a patient is to have a look into electrodermal activity. So what is meant by this? It's a very, let's say, easy task to measure the electrodermal activity. It's not so complicated like it was done 100 years ago. These days, we are only using very simple electrodes that are attached typically to one finger or two fingers. We're using a current source. It's very, very weak current, so in the range of microamperes. And so we only have to measure the voltage on these electrodes and have a direct relation to the skin conductance of the skin. Typical measurement areas we find on fingers, forehead, also on the foot probably. Less commonly used are wrists, shoulders, and armpits, even if they might be easier to access in daily life than the aforementioned fingers, forehead, and the foot. How does it look now when it comes to electrodermal activity measurement? That's a typical curve. I have here some normalized values. On the x-axis, minutes when we measured, and that's a typical behavior of skin conductance responses, as we call it, EDA. When we have a closer look into these curves, they're split up in two parts. The one is the so-called skin conductance level. That's so the tonic component that is laying under the signal. And the second one is, and I will focus on this later on, that's the skin conductance response. That's the phasic component from the signal. So we see here more, that's the very, very busy part of the skin conductance. Clearly, it's not necessary to write entire code about this. There is also an open source algorithm available. It's called CVX EDA. It's also published in 2016 in IEEE Transactions of Biomedical Engineering. That's open source, and can be freely used to pick out these two parts of a measured skin conductance response. A few things are assumed, and meanwhile they are proved to be true. So, like these algorithms assume that bursts are temporarily discrete episode, that there's a relation between the number of sweat glands. This is the underlying mechanism causing these fluctuations in the electrodermal skin response. So there's a relation between the number of sweat glands and recruited amplitude of firing bursts, and that this relation is linear and time invariant. So that's for the mathematical guys to better understand how this algorithm is working. And there is no big difference in subject-specific impulse responses, and those SCRs are relatively stable and are in a certain spectrum below 0.05 Hertz, this phasic component, that it's then used for filtering. I don't want to drill too much into detail. For us as users, it's important that we have already some ready-to-go scripts to evaluate those skin responses. They're available in MATLAB and Python, so should be worked out in nearly all evaluation processes. This algorithm can separate the phasics and the tonic components. Yeah, there are splines used to take this tonic activity in 10 seconds intervals. They are able to isolate the SDRs, which describe most likely the sympathetic activities. Moreover, this MATLAB has a find peak function that can easily be used to count the SDRs per second during the measurement. What we did then is we tried to find out, is there really a difference between tasks we apply to a group of people? So we set up a testing protocol. This consisted of 5 stages. We had a 3-minute acclimatization period where the people were asked to totally relax. Then we have an anticipation period. We showed them a relaxing video, but already started to announce that the challenge will start very soon. Then after this, we had a 5 minutes, relatively easy to moderately difficult mathematical challenge. And after this, we had even a tougher challenge with more difficult mathematical challenges, and even to increase the stress to the subject, a supervisor entered the room and sat close to the participant and observed how he or she solved the mathematical equations. After this, we had again a relaxation period. The supervisor left the room, and that the subjects could calm down after this. The setup looked roughly like this. 20 students volunteered in this project. That was in the frame of a seminar. We are, of course, informed and signed an informed consent. Then we are instrumented, like shown here. Subject is wearing the finger sensor to measure the electrodermal activity. And on the screen have been shown the mathematical challenges. And the subject, that has not to use the keyboard, gave answers by a microphone, and it was automatically correlated with a correct result of the mathematical challenge. How did the results look in this case? We see here on the upper part of this graph really the skin conductance. We see the moving of the baseline, and also we see these SCRs on it. And in the lower part of this curve, we see the skin conductance responses per minute. So the algorithm extracted this skin conductance episode, the skin conductance responses, and counted them per second, and that's the lower graph. So we can see in this case, for instance, during the acclimatization phase, the subject really relaxed. When it came to the anticipation phase, seemed to be already a little bit nervous for the test. Then we had mathematical challenge 1 and 2, and interestingly, we see that during the second test, it seems that the subject is calming down. I think that's an effect of they have been too strong, and the subject resignated and also did not relax very much in the relaxation phase. Another participant really started in the anticipation phase to relax, was challenged not too much during the mathematical test 1, and also seemed to give up during the second part of this stress. We evaluated statistically these 5 periods of the test that we see here, and more or less we focused on the skin conductance responses per minute. So we saw, interestingly, that in the acclimatization phase, we had, let's say, in mean, the highest number of SCRs per minute. Anticipation phase, they seem nicely to relax. Mathematical test 1 was obviously a challenge, and we think in the mathematical test 2 phase, people were resignated and calmed down again in the relaxation phase. The p-values demonstrated that we can distinguish nicely between the single phases, like between mathematical test and relaxation phase, the difference was significant, and so on. Only there was no significant difference between relaxation phase and anticipation phase, and that's, I think, very, very clear and straightforward. When we discuss these results, we know stress is a natural reaction to unusual, challenging situation, causes health problems, and influences our behavior. The evaluation of stress level and investigation of reactions to stressful situations is more and more addressed by researchers, and might be a helpful tool to objectively and easy can be easy measured and evaluated. The introduced measurement can be easily done, and these skin conductance responses have a direct relation to sympathetic arousals, and we can use this CVX, either open source algorithm, to evaluate our measurements. From the literature, and that's, I think, a really good message, we know that those skin conductance responses per minute can be absolutely, or the absolute values can be used to distinguish in which stage of arousal the subject is, like it is shown here. If we are below 10 skin conductance responses per minute, the subject is more or less calm. When we go above 10 skin conductance responses per minute, it's a moderate to high sympathetic arousal, and we rarely go above 20 events per minute that would come close to life-threatening situations. In our experiment with the 20 students, we could successfully observe really these different arousal states. And there comes in the initial question I raised, and also to conclude that monitoring of the ST rate is simply, and also what we saw, we are quickly in reacting to the changes in the sympathetic arousal. So we can more or less find out within minutes or seconds how the state of the subject is changing. And we can get more insight into performed specific tasks the subject is performing. That might be helpful in evaluating working processes and also self-assessment. But I also raised the question in my talk, might this kind of monitoring a subject during therapies? Because as we demonstrated, we can probably distinguish between mental underload, which might lead probably to an inefficient training, and we can also see mental overload, which might also lead to resignation and therefore reduce the efficiency of the training. So we could demonstrate it is possible to measure this sympathetic arousal, and it might be useful to use it in therapies to find out in which challenged state the patient, for instance, is. So in this way, I thank you for your attention to this little bit other topic than the previous ones, and can only say relax to be prepared for the future and the next lockdowns or whatever is coming up.
Okay, thank you very much, Manfred. I have only one thing to remember. We use a similar technique for the sympathetic skin response to evaluate in our denervated patients, is there any residual vegetative nervous system remaining or not? Yeah, this was just the same technique we used with Manfred and Winfried and Christian Hofer a little before. Okay, now I will, but I have one question. If you said we can guide the training, but if it's a heavy training, you know, all the patients become sweating immediately. Is this infecting your measurement or not?
Yeah, actually, we tried it out also with sweating patients, and the skin conductance response or the STRs are relatively stable. It doesn't change whether the patient is sweating or not. You only have to take care that the electrodes are not falling off due to sweating. But the skin conductance response is nearly the same. Since we are not evaluating an absolute value, we are only counting the single events. Right. And that can be measured whether the patient is sweating or not.